All right. Good afternoon. I want to start by just inviting everyone to stay muted throughout, if you don't mind, and then just unmute whenever you have anything to jump in on. Um, I just want to mention something about last night. Last night I taught this session about anti-Semitism that I want to just reference briefly, and just because I personally think it's important and interesting. And that is, I spoke about the White House report and commitment to address anti-Semitism. And it was finished in May, just this past May, and it is binding the government to over 100 actions over the next year. It is the first time in history that the United States government has committed to such sweeping kinds of actions. The report itself is 60 pages long, and it has 4 pillars, and it's just so smartly done. I think it's worth reading, and I encourage you to do so. For instance, it talks about not only in the very first pillar, it's not only talking about anti-Semitism, but it's talking about the contributions of Jewish Americans to the country and focusing on the contributions through the month of May, which is Jewish American Heritage Month. And one of the pillars is addressing the safety that Jews are facing in this country. And if you read the New York Times article recently, there are some awful things happening with bomb scares around the country in the last week or so that have been happening with SWAT teams showing up at synagogues. The third one is reducing the amount of acceptability of anti-Semitism in our society and noting that. Anyhow, it's extraordinarily breathtaking, all the different actions that are very specific on what the Library of Congress needs to be doing and what the VA needs to be doing and what the Department of Education needs to be doing and all of those things and what the legislature needs to be doing. And then it has this something called whole of society approach, which I love that phrase, whole of society. And it talks about academic institutions and workplaces and clergy and media and sports figures. And it gives specific directions for each one. So when people say like, oh yeah, anti-Semitism, it's a problem. Yeah, we should do something about it. It's amazing when some people sit down together and come up with an extraordinary detailed list. I happen to be part of a small group at St. Kate's that is working on something called the Goodman Lecture. It's in memory of Arthur and Connie Goodman, who were members of Mount Zion. May their memories be a blessing. And we're talking about speakers for next May. And Bill McDonough, who's one of the committee members, is the brother of Dennis McDonough, who is chief of staff to Obama and others. And he's in touch right now with Doug Emhoff to invite him to be our speaker in the spring. So who knows whether that will happen, but it's pretty exciting to imagine he's the one who was the leader of this whole White House effort. So anti-Semitism, it's a lot to tease out exactly how we think it through, and that's why we are going to be having a series at Mount Zion on Sundays in February and March, and working with the JCRC on that as well with several speakers and programs. So stay tuned. So I will look at finding a link, but I think if you Google it, it should be able to pop up. Well, I'll let someone look first and see if they can find the link. Now on to Rashi. As we talked about, last week was who is Rashi? This week is what is Rashi? But I want to start with the thinking about who is Rashi and reviewing. So what year, pop quiz, was Rashi born? 1040. Okay, which means I was thinking about waiting for the 1,000-year birthday for our trip to visit in his footsteps, but then I decided no, that'll wait too long. 1040. When did he die? Yeah, we can look on our list. Actually, I want to just see if I remember. I don't remember.
1105.
Thank you. 1105. And that part we know. The 1040 we don't know for sure, but the 1105 we know, which means that he was 55 years old when what happened? The First Crusade. So the First Crusade, and there's one of the things that I was thinking about is that how traumatic that must have been, but the crusade didn't happen from nowhere. He was studying, if you remember, in Spires and Mainz and those cities in Germany, the Schum cities, the garlic cities. And this is, if he was born in 1040, this is obviously a long time before he was born, but I was just reading that in November 1012, the Jews were expelled from Mainz. That's the city where he studied. And in January 1013, like 4 months later, they were welcomed back. So just imagine living in a time where your entire population is expelled from your own home for 4 months and then welcomed back, and think about all the things that are going on. That's the climate that is going on in the 11th century that Rashi is living. And yet it's also a time of extraordinary cooperation. So one other thought, which is, why is Rashi well known? We talked about the fact last week that this was the end of the time of the great academies in Baghdad, which was parallel to the Abbasids and the Umayyads, the Islamic dynasties there. And there was a real parallel to the center of the Jewish world being there. That was crumbling. And so a new center needed to arise. And there was a feeling of needing to go back to, now that the Talmud was codified, now that the codes were, and Midrash was over, that was finishing up. This was a new time of saying, all right, what does the text actually say? Because we were so focused on the Talmud. So now Rashi is the main person learning from Rabbeinu Gershom, not directly. Rabbeinu Gershom, the light of the exile, he was teaching in Germany along the Rhine. But he had apparently died the year that Rashi was born. It was Rabbeinu Gershom's disciples who were the ones who were teaching Rashi. So it was one generation later that Rashi was learning from. And he was clearly a quick study. I was just reading one thing, that he was 8 years old when he went to study there. So this is obviously not just for advanced degrees, it's studying when he was a kid as well. And he was quick and he was concise. Some say it was because the parchment is expensive, but he was concise. Fast forward, he dies, and years later, Gutenberg invents the printing press. What is the very first Hebrew book ever printed? The Bible with Rashi's commentary. So if the very first, that's in 1470, Rashi's commentary is the first Hebrew book that is printed. And that's another reason why it becomes the text that everyone's going to have. In Rashi's lifetime, Nicholas of Lycra, someone can help me with that, a Christian scholar, really falls in love with Rashi's scholarship and his translation, and he translates it into Latin, translates the Bible into Latin using Rashi's commentary. And then Martin Luther relies on that Latin translation for his own translation into German. So Martin Luther's commentary and translation of the Bible is 2 generations from Rashi, but really reliant on Rashi's commentary as well. Any other thoughts about who is Rashi before we transition? Questions, additions? Maury.
Your mention of Martin Luther is interesting because, as I recall, Martin Luther was a well-known anti-Semite, and I wonder if there's any connection between his use of Rashi and his anti-Semitism. I mean, I wouldn't know, but.
So my understanding is that Martin Luther was a major Philo-Semite at the beginning of his career, and then he was, reforming Christianity. And then when Jews still didn't like it, then he became more anti-Semitic. Or anti-Semitic is an anachronism, as I was teaching last night. Here's the brief book of anti-Semitism, which is not so brief. And anyhow, anti-Semitism was a term in the 19th century, 19th century. So it would just be anti-Jewish, right? But it makes sense that he was trying to make Christianity palatable for the Jews who would then they didn't pay attention. And then it led to a lot of real challenges. So I think probably earlier in his career when he's doing the translation, didn't play a role. Lisa?
I will just mention that I have a very good friend that I've known since childhood, and he became a scholar in Martin Lutheranism, and he was a professor at Augsburg for many, many, many years, and he's also a minister, and I don't know what he's doing now. But anyway, I am very good friends with him and his wife, and I'm going to ask him about all this.
You should.
He will know.
That would be wonderful. Report back, please.
I will. His name is Mark Tranvik.
All right, great.
Okay, thank you.
I'll use this as a moment to also review that last week I announced that in October of 2025, not this fall, but next fall, we are going to have a Mount Sinai trip to Germany and France in the footsteps of Rashi. I just met with the tour company yesterday, and we are going to be coming up with actual sign-up information and everything soon. But I'm very excited. Mike Hollander, who was our online tour guide, well, our physical tour guide in 2006 for those who went to Israel in 2006, and our online guide during the COVID pandemic through Germany is going to take us there. And it should be an extraordinary time for those who are able to do that. And if you have interest, be in touch. So so I mentioned that the first printed book of Hebrew was 1470. Eventually, the form of the Bible that was being used was called Mikraot Gedolot, the Great Writings, and some call it the Rabbinic Bible, but this is the way that people would study Torah was with this in the format that I'm now going to share. For those who had the sheet last week, and the one I sent out, it was the third page, which we didn't get to. But I just want to look at this for a second as a way now we say, what is a Rashi? And when we say what is a Rashi, that we're talking about, it's a commentary, and like, how do we understand his commentary? And when we talk about a Rashi, it's his commentary not only on all of Tanakh, but also almost all of the Talmud, which is also the first layer of Talmud study, is through his commentary as well. But that was finished by his grandsons when he died. So the Hebrew text part of this, is what a page of Mikraot Gedolot looks like. And if you say it just looks like a bunch of Hebrew, you are correct. But what you will notice, and here we'll just go through it slowly, this, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but where the one is, that whole section is the Torah, the actual part, and this is from the book of Exodus. Then the next layer is at the top of this page, number 2, which is the Targum, translation into Aramaic, and specifically this is Onkelos. And our commentary of Rashi also includes this because it's the first level of understanding an original-ish way of understanding Torah, meaning if this translation was the 2nd century BCE, and it was, then we're getting an insight of how the translators understood the Hebrew text by the Aramaic words chosen. So it's another tool to understand what the Torah means. So Onkelos' translation is always included. Then you go to number 3, which is right below, and it fills up both columns right below this text. And number 3 is Rashi. So it's the first layer. Shlomo Yitzchaki, he lived, as we know, Trot and Troyes. And the next, number 4, right below Rashi, Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman Garandi, who is known as Nachmanides, Spanish Talmudic scholar, great Talmudist, and also was sympathetic towards Kabbalah. The disputation, we studied at one point his disputation in 1263 with the King of Aragon, before the King of Aragon, rather. So there's that. Next to him, equally large, is Ibn Ezra, Avraham ben Meir, and we talked about three major pshat commentators of Rashi's time period. Rashi was the foremost, but Ibn Ezra was second. And David Kimchi, who's not in this one, he comes in a little bit later, is also the third that is often quoted. It goes by the name Radak. But we've got Ibn Ezra. And then somebody says, I don't get Ibn Ezra. So number 6 is commentary on Ibn Ezra. And then we've got 7 is Sforno, 16th century in Italy. And his commentary is largely devoted to a literal explanation of the text. That's what they all say. Rashbam, below him at the very bottom, is Rashi's grandson, Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir. But then you go back up to the top, right next to the text, what's called the Masorah is just little notes to say, in a Sefer Torah, you'll notice that this letter is written this way, but it should actually be pronounced this way, or something like that, that textual changes or challenges. That was texts that was written by the Masoretes who lived, as it says here, 6 to 10 centuries in Tiberias. And then this other tool, it's the hyperlinks, which are back in the day, hyperlinks to the Talmud. Where does this verse show up in the Talmud? That is called Toldot Aharon, and that's right here, number 10, and it'll just give you references to all different tractates. I don't know how much of that sunk in or meant something, but I wanted to at least give you a sense of how that a traditional page looks. Questions? All right. Somebody asked in advance, and I wanted to now share, we have been using this particular version of Rashi. So for those who have ever shown up in person at the law firm, where we have these books and other commentaries and Bible and dictionaries in a cabinet waiting for us. Some of us purchased these years ago, so we have our own personal copies. Now we have plenty of people to share. But this is the Art Scroll edition of Rashi's commentary. And we chose it because it has, I don't know if you can see, but there is some bold writing and some non-bold writing. I don't know if this is showing up, but the bold writing is a direct translation of Rashi. The non-bold writing is commentary that helps us understand what Rashi is saying. And we found that was really helpful. Plus the footnotes give us a lot of other insights about the different editions of Rashi, because the 1470 edition from Rashi is different from the 1530 edition of Rashi. And sometimes you don't know, is it a scribe messing up? Which one is the original Rashi? So those kinds of footnotes are in here as well. And there's a caveat. The Art Scroll comes with its own agenda. And so some of the translation is leaning toward an Orthodox approach to text, which obviously Rashi wasn't Orthodox because that's an anachronism, but it would make sense that it would be connected to him, but an Orthodox approach from the 21st century that is another layer of interpretation that you have to look through to understand his commentary. So sometimes that comes up. So when we go to Sefaria, for instance, you're just seeing a translation of Rashi that's a little bit different from this and a little bit more direct. And so that's why this commentary is still helpful. Questions on that? All right, now this is going to get interesting. I'm going to give you a link here in the chat. Oh, John, thank you for finding the link to the White House report. And also, Jules just informed me, and I'm glad that you're here, Jules, that Rashi was born in 1040. Just 2 years before he was born, the last Gaon of Baghdad, of that region of Babylonia, had died. And now European Jews had no one to send their letters to and questions to. So it was, again, an accident of history to some degree that Rashi was living at the time when people needed that kind of guidance, and they had lost the center of the Jewish world at that time. That was Haigaon, I think, Jules? Yeah. All right, so the link, I'm also going to share the screen, but you have it if that's easier to look on your own. Some of this we looked at last week, but now we're going to what is a Rashi. So we were saying that last week we talked about pshat, which is the contextual or the straightforward reading, or what does the Torah actually say? And this is the goal of each of these commentators, is to say what pshat is. So we looked at this first part here. I want to now transition to this phrase that we use, which is makashel Rashi. What is bothering Rashi? That's the translation. This is the background and process for studying Rashi's commentary. So I'm just reading this, and we'll explain a little bit more fully. This is weird. Why do we have this word kashem? Kashem means difficult, challenging. What is difficult or challenging to Rashi? But you know this phrase from Passover in the Seder. We have the 4 questions. They're not called the 4 questions. They're called the 4 kushiyot, the 4 problems. So that's actually something you should. So what are the 4 problems that we're dealing with the Seder that we put into the mouth of the youngest child? Because it's something that they're curious about. It's challenging to them, and they want us, and they're not even questions, if you notice that. They're actually statements that we then have to explain. So a kasha is a problem, a question, a difficulty. We, when we look at a Rashi commentary, are going to be detectives, and we have to ask ourselves what is bothering Rashi. Formulating your why questions with the difficulty. If you can answer the question with why not, then you haven't figured out the right question. So here are the questions to ask so that we focus on Torah and not just on Rashi and his time period, his biography. Fascinating, important, but now we're using his commentary as a tool to understand the Torah. So question number 1 is, what is bothering Rashi? Ma kashel Rashi. Number 2, how does Rashi resolve the difficulty? And 3, what is the concept of his commentary? So the concept of his commentary, I'll just translate it in a different way. What is his methodology? What's the main issue? And as it turns out, just scrolling down here, there are a number of primary things that he's going to be conceptually trying to focus on. Grammar, teaching us grammar. There was only one book of grammar at this time, and he refers to it, but many people didn't have books of grammar, so they didn't understand how Hebrew worked. And so part of his task is to teach us grammar. And he's also going to be bothered by, this is the big one, Lashon Yetera, seemingly superfluous words. And there are 3 different categories. It could be 2 similar words are next to each other. What's the difference? Well, it's not just because, emphasis. That's never going to be his answer. It's here to teach us something new. B, it might be something Yadua that is already known. So why are we being told this again if we already knew this? And in chapter 28, by the way, we recently came to one of his comments that was about Jacob and going to Laban, who was the father of Rebekah. And there's so many added details that are so clearly known that Rashi literally just says, I have no idea why this verse is here. So he admits when he doesn't know things, which is refreshing, I think. But generally, if something is already known, he's going to say, aha, now we are being taught this to teach us something new. Or it's a devar shenira miyoter, tells us something superfluous. It just simply is a superfluous idea that is we need to look at. Another whole category is higion. It just seems illogical, so it needs to be explained. Or what does this word actually mean? It might be, here's a fun $5 word, hapax legomenon. A hapax legomenon is a word that appears just once in the Torah. So you can't use another context to try to understand how it what it means here. You only have this one context to understand what this word means. And often we assume we know what it means because we're reading a translation, but a translation has already made a choice about what it means. So hapax legomenon. So just explaining what a word means, that's sometimes what he'll do. And then there's another challenge. Sometimes something just feels unparalleled, lack of symmetry, and he's going to explain what to do in that circumstance. So this is the rest of our time today, looking at this methodology. My thought is that I would like us to look at some of these together now, and then to divide you into groups to look at the rest of some of them together and try your hand at this. So I figure that's what we will try. So hopefully everybody who is off screen is willing to also be on screen and help with this. But if you can send me a private note if you're not interested. I'll do this in groups of 3 too. But let's start with on the sheet at the very top. Grammar, dikduk. Example, Bereshit. By the way, Bereshit in the beginning, it's the name of the book of Genesis. Genesis, Bereshit, Genesis. Chapter 4, verse 1. And as all you remember, that's the beginning of being kicked out of the Garden of Eden. So let's go now to, I guess it's to the same one, to Sepharia. So this is a text that, I mean, if you have your own Tanakh next to you, wonderful. If you want, you can go to sepharia.org, which means library.org. And you go to Tanakh, you go to Genesis, you go to chapter 4, and now we're in verse 1. And I'll go ahead and say the blessing, La'asuk b'divrei Torah, join me, and then I'll read this first. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asuk b'divrei Torah. V'ha'adam yada et Chava ishto, v'tahar v'teled et Kayin, v'tomar kniti ish et Adonai. Now the human knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gained a person with the help of Adonai. So the verse before is God banished humankind from the Garden of Eden. It was driven out east of the Garden of Eden. Were stationed the cherubim and the fiery, ever-turning sword to guard the way to the tree of life, Eitz Chaim. So the tree of life to gain immortality. We are prevented from gaining that immortality. But by the way, Eitz Chaim is now the Torah. So we gain that immortality through the study of Torah. That's the drash. Here is what's going on. Adam knew. What do we notice about the word yada? Yud, Daled, Ayin. What I notice, and I know what to notice, so I'm going to go ahead and say, is that there is no vav before this word yada. The vav means and. So look at this next verse, vatosef, vayehi. Usually, well, the tosef is more applicable. Usually the verb is at the beginning of the sentence and the vav is there, and the vav and changes the verb tense from past to future. Without a vav, it is in the perfect past, which means it's a continual habitual kind of action. And this is going to be relevant because if we look, I just clicked on that verse and then you click on commentary, click on Rashi. One of the challenges though with Sepharia, I mean, it's, well, actually, never mind. You can go to, I think you can go to the Hebrew here, but you're just looking at the English, which is most helpful for most of us. Let's just read his commentary in English, which is, and the man knew. Capital letters means it's just quoting the verse. H different translation, man versus human. Anything that is not in capitals means it's now Rashi. Already before the events related above took place, before he sinned and was driven out of the Garden of Eden. So also the conception and birth of Cain took place before this. Had it been written Vayada Adam, it would have implied that after he was driven out, children were born to him. So the first thing that we have to notice is, I didn't need to stop sharing, I apologize. We can just go right here to the method. Ma kashela Rashi. What is bothering Rashi? Go back to our verse. He doesn't say, and my question is, why is it say vayada instead of, why does it say yada instead of vayada? It doesn't ask that question. It assumes the question. So we ask ourselves, ma yada, ma kashela Rashi, what's bothering Rashi? It's that there is not a vav before this yada. By the way, there are different levels to asking the question of what is bothering Rashi. Because is that really what's bothering Rashi? I think, as you'll find out in a second, it's not. Because now we say, how is he solving this? He's solving it by saying, already before the events related above took place, before he sinned and was driven out of the Garden of Eden, what's it? What is going on that was going on before sinning? It is this yada'in, and yada is the euphemism for having sexual relations. He is saying, Adam and Eve had sexual relations before they ate from the apple, before they sinned, before they were kicked out of the garden. And then it gives us the grammatical lesson here about the vav not being there. Anyone want to offer a comment about what's going on here in your own words? What's bothering Rashi? What's he solving it, Janet?
One thing that it took me a while to understand was that for Rashi, Torah is the perfect word of the divine. So because it's from the divine, there can be nothing redundant, no grammatical errors, nothing self-contradictory. So he goes through to great lengths to make sense of something that seemingly does not make sense, including inventing things.
Yes, well said. And the inventing things is what we would then say is midrash, or sometimes he will note, here's the pshat, but I'm going to go to the midrash because it somehow just makes it work better for me. To which his grandson, Rashbam, will take him to task. But that's part of what's going on in this. Good. What else? Gloria.
I was thinking about time, and that isn't time in the Torah kind of timeless, and past is present is future, and that would indicate something like that.
That comes up specifically, said. Rashi will say, I think actually maybe, well, it's in the Talmud actually, well before him. Ein mukdam ve'ein mu'achar b'Torah. There is no earlier or later in the Torah. A very important concept, primarily related to the Exodus. So at this point, I think we had debates about this. The time started like right after the flood. That's when the world sort of started getting into a sequential order that made sense, more akin to our own. But it's something to take note of, and it's something that is debated. Yes, Janet, I know I called on you earlier. Sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. It just seems to me that without Rashi, we wouldn't have asked the question. Procreation was then not the sin. Procreation and sex was fine in the Garden of Eden. And if that's the case, then if they hadn't eaten from the apple, we would all be living in the Garden of Eden.
Well said. Yeah, so now we're getting to the heart of this, which is he's making a distinction between Christianity and Judaism with this comment, without saying it explicitly, by saying this vav, had you paid attention to it in a close textual way, which you can only know if you're reading the Hebrew, it is clear that this verb means that it was already happening. And because it was already happening, original sin is impossible. You can't derive original sin from the text. That's what's going on here. Nancy.
I always thought, and this probably doesn't figure into it at all, but after the sin of eating the apple and they were leaving, she got pregnant, and it is why it is supposed to be so painful to have children, is the reminder of the sin that was accomplished in the garden and when you had children. So that was the connection, but I guess that's just all thrown aside, right? Another great myth.
Well, what you're doing is perfect, which is you know another part of this text, and you're now saying, how does this relate to this part of the text? And that's what we're supposed to do. And sometimes commentators are going to be selective and ignore these other pieces. And that's why there are other commentaries that said you're ignoring the fact that this was the punishment for eating was pain in childbirth. It does say that clearly. So therefore, it's possible to read that as saying they didn't have sex until after they were expelled. And now you're making too much out of this one little vav, Rashi. Maybe it's just as that's when they had sexual relations and they didn't have this strict dichotomy. So it potentially can be selective reading. Good. Other reactions? Let's do another one. Back to our methodology first. So, Dikduk, again, grammar. This was a very easy grammar one. Those of us who've been studying Rashi for a while know he can go through pages on grammatical lessons that sometimes makes our eyes water. But this one was just a very simple one with a verb tense and that vav. Let's move on to his favorite topic, Lashon Yitara, seemingly superfluous words. And this is something, those who have been around the bend, we looked at this in 2005 and 2011 and 2022, I think, or 20 rather. And all of that was before we had ever gotten into Genesis 32:8. I mentioned that. But now this is in our rearview mirror. We've been to Genesis 32:8, so let's go there. X out of here, go to Tanakh, Genesis. And when I say 32:8, this is one where we've literally just done this within the past year. Let's go back to Hebrew and English. We are now in the section about Jacob anticipating his reconciliation with Esau. And this verse, by the way, is one that I heard Yehuda Kurtzer, who's now the president of Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, teaches as his way of teaching about Jewish consciousness, Jewish ways of being, that this verse is the essential way of understanding what a Jewish sensibility is in thinking about Israel, for instance. Jacob was greatly frightened. In his anxiety, he divided the people with him and the flocks and herds and camels into two camps. Lots of different ways that this is translated. Sometimes the frightened and anxiety are just sort of combined into one thing. And that actually, let me just say that let me start with the fact that there are two Hebrew words here. Vayira, Yaakov. Jacob was frightened, ma'od, very much. Vayatzar lo, and it was distressful, narrow straits like Mitzrayim, narrow places. He was distressed. He felt constricted, anxious. Sometimes the concept in Latin is called hendiades, where two different words can come to be one meaning. So some translations will just say he was extraordinarily frightened and he divided his people with him. And that's a legitimate way of doing this. It's basically the same idea, frightened and anxious. So why not just make it one thing? Not so fast, says Rashi. If the Hebrew actually has two different words, it's not trying to teach us one thing. It's not emphasis. It's trying to teach us two things. It may seem superfluous, but it's not superfluous. So this is a very typical way that our commentary works. So you go to Rashi. He feared greatly and was distressed. Again, capital letters meaning quoting the Torah verse. Now Rashi, he was afraid lest he be killed, and he was distressed that he might have to kill someone. Whereas you might just interpret this verse as just saying he was really, scared. It's now saying two different kinds of scared. One is that you would receive the horrific action, and the other is that you would be the author of that action. Very different concepts, very different challenges. I'm trying to think of the Golda Meir quote, where she's, someone will come up with it, where she is upset that that Israeli children have been taught to fear, not that they have been or taught to hate or kill, not that they would just be killed. On some level, quoting this as well. But do you see how the second word could seem to be superfluous? That's what's so Makashal Rashi. What is bothering Rashi? This second word seems like it doesn't need to be there. How does he solve it? He says this word means this, and this word means that. Any concept reactions?
But he's reading into it. I mean, the whole thing about being distressed that he'd have to kill anybody, where is that written?
It's
I mean, how come we're coming up with that idea?
So this is, we're getting to the heart of everything with that question. Is he reading something into it? Or is he trying to be real and try to embody Jacob in that moment? What is going on for Jacob at this moment, anticipating this moment of returning back? He is a powerful man. He has accumulated wealth in his 20 years with Laban. It's an insight that if you assume that we are the same human beings as they are, and to some degree, Rashi does idolize them a little bit more than we would in a straightforward reading of our patriarchs and matriarchs, then you can think about how would you react in this situation and gain some real insight for our lives, and instead of having a two-dimensional view just of this character. The critique is what you just said, but that it doesn't say that you're reading into it. The reality is it's also, by the way, the other thing that I should say is he is not making this stuff up. He is quoting Genesis Rabbah. He is quoting, and when I say Genesis Rabbah, that's the book of Midrash on Genesis. And that's a 4th century document. But why is he choosing among all the different things in our tradition to lift up that? That's the question. But it is definitely reading something in. Or you could argue in the 4th century, they had this oral tradition that this is what the text meant. And it had been, why do they know that? Because their parents had said it, and their great parents had said it. And maybe it went all the way back, maybe all the way to Sinai. Maybe that is what it actually said from the very beginning. Or maybe in the 5th century BC, someone made it up and then started passing it down the line, telephone wise. It does raise the question as what is true. But his goal is exactly that, to find what it really says. All right, let's keep going. Maury and then Rebecca.
I'm not sure whether this is about Rashi, but it makes perfectly good sense to me, maybe with my 21st century sensibilities, that you would have two different reactions. It seems to me this might be the Peshat, that is to say, I don't want to be killed. I'm scared. I'm scared to death of death, but I really don't want to kill anybody either. And those are really two different reactions. That is not one thing, as I read it.
So you're making Rashi's spirit very happy by calling what he said Pshat, because that's the goal. Pshat is, again, what each of these commentators is trying to do. And it's not just a direct reading from the text, it's also a reading into the heart of imagining who these people were, which is
the context too. I mean, we had one of the quotes from last week, and I can't remember whether it was someone saying that's the Pshat or that's the Midrash, but in any case, the context is so, I mean, at least to me, as I read anything, the context is so important.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure you can get a plain meaning without context.
And just to remind us, what is Pshat? A verse never leaves its plain sense. So is this its plain sense? Or a verse cannot be released from its unadorned meaning. Is this its unadorned meaning? Or the straightforward meaning of scripture is to be preferred? Is this the straightforward reading? The text does not leave its obvious meaning. Or don't get too weird. Is this too weird or is it not too weird? Anyway, Rebecca.
Something similar, but I was just going to add, from a psychological perspective, we are frightened by things and we have anxiety about things. So it makes sense that you would say, I am frightened by something, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to produce an anxious response.
Thank you for that insight. Great. So, and it's, the Hebrew words are very straightforward, and and you can then, and this is not a hapax legomenon, you can see all the different times that this word appears, these two different words appears, and see how are they consistent? Question mark too. All right. It's amazing how time is flying by. I want to give some time. There are a couple people who mentioned that they don't want to be, that they're unable to speak. So I'm going to put you in groups of 3. You might be in a group with somebody who is not speaking, so don't ask them to speak. But hopefully there'll be 2 people who are willing to speak. And I want you to look at least, let me just go back to our text. And if you're not speaking, you feel free to just listen in. We want you to stay till the end. I want you to go to look at chapter 40, verse 23 for another one. And then if you have time, go to these 2 as well, something we already know. So we'll have just 10 minutes to do this, and then we're going to come back for the last 5 minutes. So 10 minutes to look at a couple of these verses to try to figure out Ma Kashela Rashi, what is bothering Rashi? How does Rashi resolve the difficulty? Any questions before we split up?
Verse are we looking at?
If you have this sheet, the ones that right here, Genesis 40, chapter 40, verse 23, and then Genesis 13:5 and Genesis 28:5. So if you want to write those down, or you can go to the link if you have the link in the chat. All right. Breakout rooms. I will. And I think one more thing. I just want to give you have 9 minutes. All right. Enjoy. We'll come back for the last 5 minutes. Bye. Welcome back. For those who are watching this on the recording, I apologize that I did not pause the recording, so you had 10 minutes of blank. So I hope you fast forwarded to this moment. We are back. Everyone's coming in, and how many people figured out what was bothering Rashi, Ma Kashela Rashi, with the first text? Yay. What I was with one of the small groups, and it just shows how this way of thinking, rabbinic way of thinking, and what we do in this Rashi study group is not necessarily intuitive. We want to go to sort of like the meaning of the text, and Rashi's having us slow it down and just saying every single word is given by God, so therefore it needs to have a purpose. And if it seems to be saying the same thing, that doesn't make sense. All right, who wants to add any thoughts? Maury.
One thing that I think we noticed, or I noticed eventually, is Rashi's translation, or the translation in Rashi is different from the translation we have in Safaria. And so the problem that forgetting and not remembering becomes more clear because it's superfluous. I mean, they both mean the same thing. And we did talk about that.
My small group had the benefit of me being there, and I translated Zachar as forget or remember, and then the other one, which is very clear in the Hebrew, but not clear, as you said, in the translation. Good point. And this is the challenge. Like you might think you understand rabbinic thought, or here's the thing. You might dismiss rabbinic thought as being stupid. Like, what's the point? And you might, I think what I'm going to invite us to do, in fact, I am going to invite us to do, is to assume that you're stupid and not the text. And I apologize for being that straightforward. But if you think that you're smarter than somebody who lived 700 years ago, 800 years ago, whose words have been preserved for all these years, and like, that's stupid, they don't know what they're talking about, you don't maybe have enough of the context to understand what they were trying to say. So it's not, of course, you're not stupid. The question is, how can you slow down enough to learn, or how do you get a teacher? I can help be that teacher, to learn what are they really trying to say. Other comments? Reactions? We didn't go through all the different examples of the Rashi's methodology, but as those who've been around the bend a few times, around the corner a few times, we often have the seemingly superfluous thing as something that Rashi focuses on. And we even notice things that are seemingly superfluous to us, and Rashi doesn't comment, and that bothers us even more.
So Rabbi, the prayer on Friday night about, did you mean the struggle for us too? I think that's what this is about. That the struggle is what helps you to truly know Torah in a different way from just reading an English translation.
Thank you. So for those who have been part of this Rashi study group, and I'm sharing with others who have come just for this part, we will take just one verse. We even tried to do more than one verse in this. We did several verses already in this one Rashi. That is unusual. Often we will just do one verse, and first we'll just read the verse, and then we'll ask ourselves what's bothering us. Then we ask ourselves, what do we think is going to bother Rashi, Makashel Rashi? And then we'll look at Rashi's commentary and see what it actually is bothering Rashi. And sometimes it takes us a while to figure that out. And then we might bring in Nachmanides or others and to see how they're critiquing what Rashi is saying. And then all of a sudden you gain some significant insights about our tradition or about our own lives. Doesn't happen every time, but there are enough times where it does. So to that moment, I'm saying we're not going to meet next Thursday. We're going to meet the last Thursday of August. And then we're not going to meet much of September because of high holidays, but we're going to meet the last Thursday of September. Last Thursday of August, last Thursday of September, both are going to be Zoom only. If you're not on our Rashi's email list and would like to be, email Julie Beckman and she will put you on, and so you'll get the Zoom links. If this was sufficient for you, and I'm glad you came and learned for this time. Take care, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. Oh, and tonight is Elul. Happy Elul. This is the month preceding high holidays, so go work on your souls.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.